And hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Pumpkin Coptercast, the only video game show. So today, I am once again joined by Ashley,
That's
you,
me.
who was previously on the show to talk about the fantabulous throw everything up Grapple Force Arena. Now, a whole new game is presented before us and is currently on Kickstarter and is in fact in the final stretch of its Kickstarter. It's a very successful Kickstarter.
Only 40 some hours to go. 41 hours as of this recording.
Yeah. So latest game is Pedal Crash, which according to the blurb on the Kickstarter is a brand new chain building arcade action puzzler for PC and mobile set in featuring a colorful cast of characters in a floral fantasy world.
hmm That's the game I'm working on.
So
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
you're welcome. So let's just fast forward few theoretical months and years in this game's development, and like suppose we're at a PAX and a PAX goer is asking you what this game is about as their senses are assaulted by all the bright and cheery characters and the blocks.
Well, we are actually planning to show this game at PAX South,
Yay.
coming in January. So I suppose this will be useful practice to sort of get my pitch down. So Pedal Crash is an action puzzle game, sort of in the tradition of the arcade action puzzle games that took off sort of from the early to late 90s, from the period of around 91 to about 97. I think these sort of games were popular in arcades for a while. Some of the more well known examples include Puyo Puyo, I think, would be sort of the most successful out of that particular era.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also Panel de Pon, aka Tetris Attack, was another particularly successful puzzle game in this genre. It wasn't an arcade game, but came out on the Super Nintendo and was pretty successful. Basically, the sort of puzzle game where you have to you're sort of given an assortment of like pieces or blocks and like a sort of rule for the interactions between them, and you have to sort of sort out the most high value kind of move you can do within a sort of time pressure, like a limit time frame. I would say is the definition I'm going with for what an action puzzle game is. Tetris, of course, is another example. These games were often called Tetris clones. Uh, Panel de Pon was literally called Tetris in America, even though it's nothing like Tetris, really. Uh, I could go on and on about examples of other puzzle games that were the inspiration behind here, but most people would not recognize most of them. I'm actually sort of a fan of the more obscure and kind of strange and unpopular examples of this genre, and I've played a whole bunch of them. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So that's sort of the base of the inspiration for like the sort of genre that Pedal Crash fits into. But what's unique about Pedal Crash is that it is unique in that the sort of main mechanic behind it is not something that I've ever seen be done in a puzzle game before of this kind. So, in most of these kinds of games, the most common interaction you have is so called falling blocks, which is to say you have like a play field, then you have pieces that come down from the top, and you sort of have to arrange them in certain ways. Tetris, of course. Puyo Puyo is this kind of game. Puzzle Fighter is this kind of game. Cleopatra Fortune is this kind of game. Then some puzzle games you interact with more of like a board from what you might imagine as a top-down perspective. Um, a lot of sliding block puzzle games or puzzles in other games are of this kind. Sort of, they're really common in adventure games, I think. Sort of sliding block puzzle segments. There's a game I can't quite remember the name of, but it actually involves like rotating the entire playfield. Um, but Pedal Crash's mechanic is not falling blocks. The blocks actually steadily appear over time on the board, and the way you interact with them is you can push a block in any direction, and the block just keeps on traveling until it hits a block or a wall. And if the block it hits is of the same color, then those two blocks and any blocks of the same color connected to them burst. And when they burst, they push other blocks next to them, which can in turn hit other blocks of the same color and burst, etc., which causes big, impressive chain reactions that are super fun to pull off. So, that's sort of the basic mechanic behind Pedal Crash, is that it's sort of a game about pushing blocks around and sort of arranging them in such a way that when they burst, they'll push other blocks, etc. And since you aren't... Something that's unique about Pedal Crash as opposed to these other action puzzle games is that the blocks aren't falling or building up in any sort of way in real time. They actually appear as you make moves, so you can actually take as much time as you want in order to make a move. So you can sit there and like puzzle over what your next move is going to be. But I did say that the definition I'm using for action puzzle is that there is time pressure. And in this case, the pressure comes from the fact that in the single-player time trial mode, there is a time limit where you have to get the highest score you can, so making faster moves is incentivized. And in the two-player versus mode, it's sort of a race to make as many clears as possible in a short time. So even though you can take as much time as you want to set up your next move and puzzle over like the situation you're in, you're definitely incentivized to keep going quickly if you can.
Okay. And I noticed by checking out the Kickstarter page literally right now as we're talking, it's got what I can only describe as like almost like a Game Boy or Game Boy Advanced-ish visual style.
Yeah, it's actually styled specifically as a Game Boy Color game.
Yeah, that's what it was.
In the I really drive it home in the trailer where I made a fake Pedal Crash Game Boy Color cartridge and shot some footage of me like sitting down on a park bench and like putting it into my Game Boy Color and booting it up. But it's not an actual Game Boy Color game. It just is sort of styled as one. There's a funny story actually behind why I settled on the Game Boy Color look. I don't know if it actually qualifies as a funny story, but there was actually a process behind it. So I actually originally, when I prototyped the mechanics of the game, I had no idea how it was going to look. But what I wanted it to look like was one of the arcade games that sort of inspired this sort of game, like the kinds of games I was playing a lot of at the time. But having made a game with like relatively high graphical production values, such as Grapple Force Arena, which isn't, I think, an amazing looking game, but I feel like the level of graphical production for it for one person was pretty high, especially for how long of a game it was. So I was really attached to the idea of making it look like an arcade game, but I sort of had to practically scale it back a little bit so it would look like... How to explain? It would be more that I'd be sort of at the high end of a lower bracket of like graphical fidelity instead of being at the low end of a higher bracket, if that makes sense. Like I want it to look more like a really impressive Game Boy Color game than like a really underwhelming arcade game, if that makes sense.
Yep. So
So the reason I went with Game Boy Color specifically is not necessarily because I have any sort of special fondness for Game Boy Color graphics, because I actually don't. Um, I have an appreciation for it and for sort of what people were able to do within the limitations, but unlike Grapple Force Arena's sort of like general like Sega sound, like I'm a huge FM synth fan, so I had to put it in Grapple Force Arena. This time it was sort of facilitated by the needs of the project. And what inspired it was actually the biggest aesthetic inspiration behind Pedal Crash was an arcade game called Poochie Carrot made by Taito in 1997, which was a very similarly aesthetic, a similar, an aesthetically similar game. I say as if it was a coincidence, but it completely wasn't. It sort of features the same sort of premise of characters in a fantasy world having to assemble artifacts to make a wish, which was actually relatively common in arcade games at the time. Like Waku Waku 7 had basically the exact same plot, so I didn't feel too particularly bad about lifting it. Um, and it was a very impressive looking arcade game that had like giant animated characters on these backgrounds. Gameplay wise, it was nothing alike. It's more of a breakout clone, but aesthetically, it was a huge inspiration. And it actually did get a Game Boy Color port. And that's what gave me the idea like, oh, if I can't make it look like this really visually impressive arcade game, I could make it look like a Game Boy Color port of a very visually impressive arcade game, and sort of like imagine what it would be like to try and push up against the boundaries of a less powerful system to make a as close as possible version of a game that was released in arcades. So at the start of the project, I was actually calling it Pedal Crash Pocket because I was considering Pedal Crash to be like the hypothetical arcade game it was based on. But over time, I thought that it ended up looking good enough that this could just be Pedal Crash. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so, so how long, when the game is, finally released out into the world, how long will it have taken from, like, initial idea to finished product?
Um, this is actually a rare case where I have it documented, like when I started working on the game. So, uh, with Pedal Crash, I had the sort of vague idea for the game mechanics, like one night before going to bed, and was thinking about, oh, I should remember this and try making it. I was just sort of imagining the interaction of having a play field and then, like, sort of panels or blocks or discs or something sort of gliding across the playfield and bursting and sending other ones flying. And I thought that seemed like a really fun interaction, so I was like, oh, tomorrow I'll just prototype this. And then the next day I got up and I prototyped it. And like the very first day, I was already like arranging blocks in such a way as they would make bigger chain reactions and stuff. And I immediately realized like, oh, I've actually got something pretty special here. Like this is already fun. So I like within a few days I'd already committed to making it my next major project.
Okay. And so, like I see it's got quite a bit of various
Saved
modes.
like a GIF.
So,
Is everything going okay?
yes. So, like, what
And
exact...
I
Oh,
wasn't done
sorry.
with my so I started the game in April, and the planned release date is sometime in the spring of 2020. It'll be whether that's early spring or late spring is still sort of up in the air and depends on a lot of other factors. So probably the entire development cycle of Pedal Crash will be roughly a year or a little more.
Okay.
Mhm.
So, like, what are the various modes that will be found in the game once it's out, and would you say they differ from one another?
Okay, so the most basic sort of game mode is solo play, which is sort of your arcadey, like, play the game by yourself and try to get the biggest score you can. There's time trial, which is pretty self explanatory, which is you just have a play field and you try to score as many points as you can within a certain limited amount of time. Um, so clearing blocks gives you points, and if you do chain reactions, it actually multiplies the points you get by clearing the blocks sort of semi exponentially. So if you get a huge chain reaction and you clear 10 blocks in one go, it's worth a lot more points than clearing like 10 blocks separately, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so in time trial, you can choose your time limit, and there's also an option to make the board a lot smaller. It changes it from 8 by 8 to 6 by 6 and removes the number of colors from 5 to 4 colors. And that's really good if you're just getting started and you sort of want to reduce the amount of complexity in it. There's also another option called turbo mode, which actually doubles the speed of all of the animations of the puzzle. So that's really good if you're really impatient and want to like really cram as much sort of action as you can. That was actually added at the request of one of my friends who was playtesting the game for me, and she got better at the game than me and was sort of complaining about having to watch the animations of the chain reactions play out over time. So I added in a turbo mode so that they would play out twice as fast and she could get right to making more moves. Because something about Pedal Crash is that when you push a block, you have to basically wait for the move to play out before you can push another one.
Yeah.
So if you set up a giant chain reaction, it takes a few seconds for it to go off. In solo play, there's time trial, but there's also another mode which I haven't seen really the equivalent of in another game that I've called turn trial, which is you don't have a limited amount of time. You can take as much time as you want, but you have a limited number of moves. So you have to get as many points as you can, making only, say, like 150 moves on the board. And building chain reactions is like absolutely crucial to score high in turn trial, because you can't just cram in as many clears as you can in a short amount of time. You have to really make them count. So that's the solo play mode. The versus mode works a little differently. In the versus mode, you and an opponent, either another player or a computer opponent, each have your own board. And on the bottom of the screen, there's a bar with a little divider on it. And as you make clears, you push that divider closer towards your opponent's side of the screen. And if you get enough clears ahead of your opponent, you score a point or a hit. And if you score 3 hits, then you win. So the idea behind the versus mode is that when you score a hit, the bar resets back to the middle position, but the play fields stay the same. So there's actually a way to get a persistent advantage. And that is, if you make a chain reaction in versus mode, it sends over obstructions to your opponent's board, which are garbage blocks. So there's something very similar in Puyo and in Puzzle Fighter, and basically almost every competitive puzzle game is that if you do some kind of impressive move, you can send interference over to the other player's board. And the garbage blocks in this game, they appear twice as fast as regular blocks do, and they can't be pushed. And the only way to clear them out is by clearing other blocks next to them. So setting up chain reactions takes more time than just simply making clears, but if you can pull it off, you can gain a persistent advantage. And there's sort of a level of like strategy and counterplay to it, where you have to sort of weigh the risk of taking extra time to set up chain reactions and potentially fall behind in order to get the persistent advantage to win the match overall. And there's also another win condition in that if your opponent's playfield fills completely up and they can no longer make moves, then you automatically win, no matter how far behind you were. So you can actually ignore the tug-of-war mechanic and the hits entirely if you're confident that you can send over so much opponent that they can no longer clear it and have to let their board fill up.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's another mode, which is the puzzle mode. Now, there are lots of puzzle games that have had a similar mode to this. Tetris Attack for the Super Nintendo was one of them, where you have a preset board and a limited amount of moves in order to meet the clear conditions for it. So in this mode, like, understanding the way the blocks interact is sort of important to being able to solve the puzzles. Now, the clear goal for each puzzle can vary a little bit. Some of them you have to clear just one kind of block, some of them you have to clear all of the blocks. And what's also different between puzzles is that the number of moves you have can be limited, but also the sort of types of moves you can do can be limited. For example, you might have a puzzle where you can only push left like 2 times, and you can push right once, and can't push up or down at all. So you might have to solve a puzzle that has a very limited sort of constraint of what sort of moves you can do. The puzzles, each character playable in the puzzle mode will get 25 puzzles to themselves, and you sort of have a board like a 5x5 grid of puzzles, and the one in the middle starts out unlocked. And as you clear the puzzles, the ones adjacent to that on the board become unlocked too. So if you get stuck on a puzzle, you can go back and try a different one and like sort of take different paths to clear out all the puzzles you can. The further you get towards the edges of each puzzle board, the trickier the puzzles get. And the last mode I have to talk about is the story mode. And the idea behind the story mode is that you pick one character and you have to face each of the other characters in a versus match as a computer opponent. And as you win matches, the difficulty of the computer opponents goes up steadily. But if you lose a match, the difficulty goes down and you get the opportunity to retry it. The idea being that you want to clear it on as high of a difficulty level as you can in order to get sort of the best score, the best ranking. There's sort of other special stuff that can happen if you get it up to a particularly high difficulty level and get towards the end of the story mode, but that's a secret. So I can't really elaborate on exactly what happens then.
Okay. And once the game is all set and ready to go, what platforms do you intend to release Pedal Crash on?
Pedal Crash is coming out for PC and Linux, and we just recently hit the stretch goal that'll come out on Mac as well. And it's a PC game, but it's also a mobile game. It has a special layout for phones that's like sort of portrait orientation, and you can push the blocks just by like touching them and flinging them in whatever direction. And it actually works surprisingly well. I actually had no intention of making it a mobile game at the start, but when I started sort of testing touch controls, I realized that the game worked really, really well on phones. So it'll be available also for Android and for iOS now that we hit the stretch goal.
Okay, and yeah, and like, what aspect of the game, either like mechanically or visually or musically, would you say is your favorite part thus far?
My favorite part? Well, it's hard for me to play favorites with the parts of the game because I feel like the sort of the game as a whole cohesive experience is very shaping up to be very good. I feel like all the parts of it individually are turning out very well. The parts I'm responsible for I'm particularly proud of, such as the character designs and the animations and the gameplay mechanics and such. I'm extremely happy with how the music's shaping up. The musician is Michael Staple, who worked on Grapple Force Arena as well. And he's posted up an example track, a 30-second preview of a Lily Breeze stage theme. The writing of the story mode is actually being done by Zach Morrison, who makes a webcomic called Paranatural, which I really enjoy. And I'm super excited to work with them on this. I've wanted to hire Zach to write a game ever since they started taking writing commissions, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. Like all of the character interactions between everybody are just every interaction is just like pure gold so far, and the character dialogue is like the dialogue is hilarious, but also the characters each have sort of their own kind of emotional arc they go through in the story mode. So it actually is it's a lighthearted story, but it actually does take itself seriously as a story. It's not just like a parody of itself, if that makes sense. I wanted it to be very genuine, and I think that people will really enjoy these characters and really kind of start rooting for them as they play through the story mode. So I can't pick out which part of it is my favorite because I'm extremely happy with all of it, is I guess the answer.
Okay. And yes, and with that, we come to the conclusion of this particular episode of the Pumpkin Copter Cast. I would like to thank Ashley for once again joining me and talking about this latest game that is in the works.
You're welcome.
And if any of the -7 people listening to this enjoyed what they heard, you can subscribe to the Pumpkin Copter Cast. If for whatever reason after that you wish to give me a money, you can go to patreon.com/thepumpkincoptercast. If any of you are interested, there will be a link to the Kickstarter of Pedal Crash in the description of the video, so you can check it out and see how much money you want to throw at it. And before we sign off, Ashley, is there anything else you want to plug or promote?
Nope, there isn't, but I have to make sure that you remind everybody to have a gourd day.
Yes. The catchphrase that was brought to life and now cannot be killed by mortal hands. So, yes, as I am now bound by a blood oath to say at the end of every episode, have a gourd day, everyone.
Bye-bye for now.